When you observed the defendant, you say he walked towards you?
Yes.
Did you notice any blood on him, sir?
Yes.
And where did you notice the blood?
Down his nostrils, streaming down both sides of his lips.
You also asked him what happened.
Yes.
And he said, this guy was beating me up and I shot him.
And I had to defend myself and I shot him.
I'm sorry.
I was defending myself and I shot him.
More explosive testimony in the George Zimmerman trial, charged, of course, with the murder of Trayvon Martin. Joining me now is former prosecutor and author of Killer Ambition, Marcia Clark from California, and criminal defense attorney Richard Portale, former prosecutor. Marcia and Richard, thanks for being with us this evening. Marcia, the prosecution has to prove that Zimmerman was not defending himself, but Trayvon is dead. How do we know? I mean, can we ever get a complete story here?
You know, I don't think that you ever will, and that's really very common in criminal trials. You have one party to the action is deceased and can't tell his side of the story. But we put together as much as we can and hope that all of the big pieces are in the correct places. And in this case, we have a lot of back and forth. At this point, there is some evidence now that there may have been a valid claim of self-defense. There's also evidence, however, that George Zimmerman was the aggressor. We're about halfway through the prosecution's case, or maybe a little more, so there's much more to come. And we do have to hear from the coroner. The autopsy will be extremely important to show what kind of defensive wounds or injuries Trayvon Martin might have had, the angle of the bullet, the trajectory of the bullet. We have a lot more to go. But at this point, there's a great deal on both sides.
Okay, but, you know, as Marcia says, Richard, there's been a lot of testimony as to who was on top during the fight, testimony regarding the blood on Zimmerman. Is there any clear picture here yet of what happened?
I think there's a very clear picture. You can't overlook the wounds on Zimmerman. There are wounds in the front and there are wounds in the back. There are lacerations on the back of his head, and they're consistent with what his story is and with the testimony of the neighbor John Good,
right,
who testified that he believes, based on the color of the clothing, that Martin was on top and Zimmerman was on the bottom. He believed that he saw a type of, like, what he described as an MMA ground and pound maneuver, with Martin being the one on top.
The MMA, martial arts?
Mixed martial arts, ground and pound, which is so the person on top is
Zimmerman
giving
the
it to
guy
him.
who was taking the martial arts classes?
Maybe
Interesting you use that.
Maybe he wasn't paying attention in class.
Maybe not. All right.
But he had he had a broken nose, bilateral black eyes, and wounds on the back of his head. So wounds in the front, wounds in the back.
All right, Marcia, what Richards is saying is this guy has injuries, but is that enough to justify his shooting Trayvon Martin?
Well, that is the issue. That's the issue, Judge, right there framed. Yes, of course, he is injured. We've known that from the start. We knew that there was a struggle between them. We knew some kind of contact happened between them, and Trayvon got some licks in, and we'll find out exactly what happened to Trayvon, what Zimmerman did to him. But at the end of the day, the jury has to decide, are the wounds that Zimmerman suffered evidence of sufficient force having been used upon him to show that he was reasonably fearful of imminent death or great bodily injury? That is what the jury is going to have to decide. Some will look at those wounds. I look at the back of the head, the front of the face, and I say, you know, it doesn't look that bad. On the other hand, you know, somebody can be in the throes of being beaten up and feel as though the end is near, regardless of what the injuries look like at the end. So that,
Marcia, what you're talking about is, even though objectively we may say, hey, this guy didn't even go to the hospital, you know, the EMT just kind of bandaged him up, you're saying that in his own mind, it is his subjective perception, Richard, that will dictate whether or not he was justified in taking a gun and shooting Trayvon.
Yes,
no, not subjective, Judge, not subjective. That's irrelevant. He has to be objectively, a reasonable man standard is in play here. A reasonable person has to fear for imminent death or great bodily injury, but regardless of what George Zimmerman personally felt. You have to be able to stand outside and say a reasonable person would feel that way too. But otherwise, there is no self-defense.
If there is a subjective feeling that, oh my God, I'm going to lose it here, and he's not so out of the reasonable man standard, then.
Well, if it comes down to it, if it comes down to the wire, and it's very close on the reasonable man standard, and he gets up on that stand, I think he has to. I think he has to get up on the stand and say, I was fearing for my life. Look at my nose. Look at I have black eyes in both eyes. Look at the wounds on the back of my head. And this is what I'm telling you. This is how I felt. You have to feel how I felt on that day. And if he does it and he's successful, he's going home.
All right. Marcia, do you think that he'll take the stand, Zimmerman?
No, I don't. I don't think he will. I don't think they want him to, and I don't think he needs to. Now, at the point in time that we're at, and we're not even done with the case by any stretch, they have enough evidence in the record to get an instruction on self-defense. If he does take the stand and say something like what was just framed, then it's entirely possible the jury will think, at the very least, that he personally believed he was in imminent danger,
Right.
even if it may not reasonably be true. But if the jury thinks that, if the jury thinks, well, he thought so, but I don't think, objectively speaking, a reasonable person would, that would still be a manslaughter charge. That would not be a walking home charge.
No doubt. Richard, because we're wrapping right now, you think there's going to be a not guilty here right off the bat?
I do.
All right. Supported by an argument?
I think the wounds speak for themselves, and I think the testimony of the neighbors support the wounds and support the physical evidence, and I think that each of these prosecution witnesses has been converted by the defense by West.
All right. Marcia, Richard, thanks for being with us. And coming up, did the NFL